Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone to another session of Muslim Circles Ramadan lockdown lecture series. And with us today, we're honored to have Imam Khalid Latif all the way from the epicenter, New York City. And just a little bit about Imam Khalid. There's really so much to say about him. Imam, we're so blessed to have you with us. He's the University Chaplain for New York University, the Executive Director of the Islamic Center at NYU, co-founder of Honest Shops, described as the first ever all-natural organic halal butcher in New York City. And in 2007, Mayor Michael Bloomberg had nominated him to become the youngest chaplain in the history of the New York City Police Department at the age of 24. I have to say, in 2020, you're still very young in my books. And the topic today is one of favorites of so many, right? About the Sahaba. We always hear about them. They've become legends in our eyes. And today you're going to talk about how these group of extraordinary men can relate to us today and how we can continue their legacy in 2020. So Imam, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We thank him, we praise him, we glorify him. We beseech him to send his choicest salutations upon his most beloved sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam, and upon all those who choose to tread in his path until the last day. Alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be here with you all, joining in. And my family and I were blessed to be in Malaysia some years ago, where I met many of the people who are coordinating and leading this programming. My children, they still remember quite vividly being in your beautiful country. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll soon be able to travel again, and hopefully we'll be able to spend some time together in person. And I pray that you all are safe and keeping well, and that Allah protects you from any type of affliction or ailment of any kind. And I would appreciate prayers of the same for my city here, where in New York City, we're at the epicenter of this pandemic, and it's quite difficult to say the least. In terms of the conversation that we're looking to have today on the role of the legacy of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajma'een within today's society and what we can pull from it and extrapolate for our own purposes, we want to first define and identify certain terms to then be able to give application to them within the course of our day-to-day routines, and to not treat it as something that exists on a very grand scale that is then hard to trickle down to our lived realities, but to understand that the connection between us and that generation that was defined as the best generation within the Islamic tradition is a thread, a link of a 1400-year-old living tradition that roots and connects us despite where we might be placed today geographically, our cultural heritage, our racial background, the social class that we are a part of, as well as have us connected to generations that lived prior to this time, years ago, decades ago, even centuries ago, because that living tradition is enough for us to share something that transcends any type of socially constructed difference. To be a Sahaba of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it necessitated a certain set of prerequisites being met. One, you had to actually meet the messenger of God at some point in your life. And two, you had to pass away in a state of Iman, a state of faith. And these two things became what one could then satisfy. They were then deemed to be from that generation. So somebody could have intended to go and meet the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have, for example, people like Uwais al-Qarni, who wanted to go, and his story is told of us, and the Prophet tells Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh to look for him when he comes later on and ask him to make dua for you, he says to Umar. Because Uwais of the Qarn tribe, he had the opportunity to go and meet the Prophet and become a Sahaba, but he had an elderly mother at home that needed care for. And so he opted to stay at home with her and forego the opportunity of meeting the Prophet of God. You have individuals like that there are opinions on that vary in terms of what their classification is, but nonetheless, they had enough faith that they were being told they were of those that the Khulafa Rashidun were being told to have them pray for you. And they were contemporaries of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but they didn't meet him. So that doesn't allow for them to be within that category. You then have individuals who unfortunately passed during that time period who had interacted with the Messenger of God, but did not necessarily enter into the religion, did not embrace the faith. So they too would not be given the designation of being a companion, a Sahaba. And then we have to understand that over the course of 23 years of revelation, there are people who are companions of the Prophet of God who left from the community to go live elsewhere within the first years of it. There's people who left over the course of 23 years to go and live in other parts of the world. There's people who were children at the time of Revelation's first coming. There was people who were born during that 23 years of revelation, people who passed away. The Prophet ﷺ's farewell khutbah was given to 120,000 people. And to understand that they were amongst those who had distinctions in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of class, professional ambition, so many different variables that came into play within their identity that gave their experience as that first generation something that was quite diverse. It was not homogeneous. They were not all the same. And what they afford to us is an opportunity to understand where and how the religion was meant to be practiced, not just on a theoretical, abstract level, but on a practical level, a real level. Because 120,000 companions alone at the farewell khutbah, let alone all of the people who lived during that 23 years of revelation, they interfaced with the Prophet ﷺ, left the world in a state of Iman. There was arguably a lot more people than that. And the generation in its entirety is called the best generation, right? Khayru quruni qarni, khayru ummati qarni, that the best of my ummah is my generation, that the best of generations is my generation, says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, to understand how it fits into where we are today, it necessitates us pitting our reality with their reality, and to not be in a sphere where we exist here and our introspection in the presence is rooted in a retrospect that romanticizes or idealizes that which transpired in that first generation's time. But we see that the Prophet ﷺ giving them advice and insight over the course of that 23-year period of revelation was met with varied experiences. You had individuals who had deep conviction and certitude that right from the onset, Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, Ali radiallahu an, Abu Bakr radiallahu an, from amongst the first to become Muslim, that Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha right off the bat, Abu Bakr radiallahu an right off the bat, Ali radiallahu an, they said, was so young when he actually takes Islam from the Prophet that he's not even considered somebody to be a convert because he was at such a young age that he wasn't even muqallif at that time. And he was just somebody who had that yaqeen, that certitude. Subhanallah. You have the likes of Abu Dar and Salman al-Farsi and Abdurrahman ibn Auf and Umar ibn al-Khattab and Uthman ibn Affan and Musab ibn Umair and so many people whose names we know and whose stories we know. Fatima bint Muhammad, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, Salama, Nusayba, so many who were noted and recognized by their efforts, their actions, what they did. There's also so much of what they did and so much of what others did that was in 120,000 people by the end of it, the farewell khutbah. And so many more who were not there at that time that our viewpoint of them cannot be devoid of reality. They excelled not because they did everything perfect, they excelled because they knew how to get back on their feet after they had fallen. When I say we shouldn't romanticize or idealize, Islam is about reality. The synergy that we have between our practice, our ritual, our faith, iman, and what we call ihsan, that blends the two in such a way that it enables us to draw understanding and meaning as we synthesize everything that the world puts into us so that we can find a sense of purpose in how we move forward. And that type of spiritual increase does not come from doing everything correct. That type of spiritual increase comes from recognizing that you have areas of improvement. And one of the biggest challenges that we have, especially in the framework of modernity, is that religion in and of itself, within ritual practice, can become quite ritualistic. And a legalistic framework enables us to know how to worship and to have time-tested methods that give us spiritual increase and draw us closer to God as we better understand ourselves. But can also very easily become devoid of methods of ethics and morals, an understanding of why we do what we do and what it is that we are compelled to be moved by. And so we have such a point of interaction that we can draw lessons from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, but within the companions of the Prophet, we can find within their lives and their existence so much that parallels things that we do, because they were still those who also made mistakes in the ways that we do. I sat down with a group of brothers before all of this pandemic happened, and we were talking about how you can draw meaning from the prophetic biography and the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And there was a lot that people were gaining from the conversation. That it was a group of guys talking to a large number of men in a space that we were creating to try to create positive masculinity and ideas of what Islam says about manhood and being a man. And one of the people who was in the discussion came from a non-Muslim background and then converted to Islam. And he said that I found such deep connection to the prophetic biography when I was looking into Islam, that the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ was something that resonated so deeply. But he said what really brought me close to Islam was reading the stories of the companions, because I could find myself in their experiences. How some of them struggled after becoming Muslim with things like alcohol and zina. How some of them found themselves in places where they weren't all perfect, but they made their mistakes. How they still demonstrated that they could not just accept one another in terms of what they were doing that was difficult and a struggle, but how they learned to still find a sense of self-forgiveness and self-love that enabled them to believe that they could still be entitled to having a relationship with Allah. And how the Prophet ﷺ, as a guide and a teacher and a leader for all of them, help them to walk through their struggles and walk through their difficulties and find themselves in a sphere of existence that enabled them to believe that they were bigger than any of the wrong actions they might undertake, and that nothing that they could do that was wrong would ever be greater than Allah's mercy. And I would say that that's the legacy that we have to embrace within Muslim experience today. To let people be people, to let them be human, to exert an air of compassion, both for the other as well as for oneself. Because the hadith is real. And we find within it the narration that tells us a time will come where holding on to a sunnah is going to be like holding on to a flaming coal in your hand. And you see much difficulty, much challenge that comes, not just in non-Muslim societies, people coming from diverse backgrounds, but within Muslim spaces and Muslim societies, becoming quite rigid, becoming in a sphere where it is myopic and only in a sphere of existence that allows for things to be legalistic. What the companions did was counter some of what it is that we compel ourselves towards within the framework of modernity. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of amazing advancement within a modern frame. I literally right now, I'm sitting in New York City. Many of you are sitting in Malaysia. The brother is sitting in Indonesia. There's people from all over the world, and we are talking to each other as if we were all sitting in the same room, subhanAllah. Let alone decades or centuries ago, you couldn't even do this probably 5 years ago, 8 years ago. There's an interconnectivity that modernity has allowed for us to have that just didn't exist before. But so too within modernity, the common era, today's society, we find certain challenges. And in the framework of modernity, one of the challenges we find is that there becomes a diminishing of spaces of stillness. There becomes a decrease in spaces of reflection. And you find also in the prism of modernity a very unique form of the ailment of loneliness that has just never existed before. And I would say that it stems from some of these things. That within Muslim experience, the companions embodied a sense of solidarity amongst themselves. They looked out for one another. And the Prophet ﷺ called them to not simply be people who looked at externals or forms, but looked at internals, and said that Allah does not look at these bodies. He looks at your hearts and your actions. He gave them insight, and his pedagogy was not one that was just about rote memorization, but it was about experience and understanding through experience. Do you ever wonder why the Prophet ﷺ opted to send his companions to Abyssinia, what we know as modern-day Ethiopia, a kingdom under the Najashi, the Negus, who gives all of them sanctuary in his kingdom? But it's also a society, a kingdom that is ruled by people who are black. And the Meccan society is a Meccan society that is based off of a stratification tied to race and class. They took people who were not of their race, not of their lineage, not of their class, and treated them atrociously. The Prophet's socialization of these companions had them go to a place where they were able to embrace not just their own practice of faith, but to see in person the reality of what is possible when you do not determine authority or goodness or wellness based off of things like race. They needed to see what it was like to be in a kingdom that had a black king. And they can come back, they can spread the word so that there is not the plague of racism and arrogance that was the first act of Shaitan that got him kicked out of Jannah, that I am of fire and you are of earth, I must be better than you. They were not connecting at the level just of externals and bodies, but at internals. They were vulnerable enough to make mistakes, but also accept the mistakes that they made. And the mistakes were not just about doing the wrong thing, but in the reactions to it. The Prophet has a companion by the name of Abdullah. Abdullah has narrations where he is joking with the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And one of the characteristics that we know of this companion was that he had a problem in drinking alcohol. He would come and take the had punishment, and other people would speak poorly of him. And our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say, don't say such things. He loves God and his messenger. But there was an understanding both from Abdullah, hearing that the Prophet had his back and was walking with him through his struggle. And he showed us how to confront struggle himself. But the other companions also heard that you should not talk to people like this. You don't want to be a reason to push them down. You want to be a reason to bring them up. And when there becomes an absence of stillness in the framework of modernity, there becomes an absence of places of reflection. Houses of God, books of God, messengers of God, communities of God, they are not meant to draw attentiveness to anything other than God. That the house of God should not be about drawing your focus to the house, but should be about bringing your focus to the divine. And as a community of a messenger of God, an ummah of a messenger of God, the idea is to bring people to God and not to just what we share in common that creates in-groups and out-groups or makes things difficult. And what the companions aspired towards was a sense of trying to find depth in their vision. Their legacy was such that both inwardly and outwardly, they looked to find meaning and purpose. So for example, if we were to look at our religion in a dimensional sense, and we put on a horizontal, what we call Islam, our ritual practice, this is what most of us have. And this was just not even the starting point for the companions, because the first revelations were not about do's and don'ts and rights and wrongs. The first revelations were about Allah and the afterlife. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says that if the first revelations came down saying prohibit this and obligate this, nobody would be Muslim. But this is what most of us have. Prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage. And of that, we have probably the first couple because we do them. But if you ask most people, what are the rules of zakah? How do you perform the pilgrimage? And not in a place where you are accusing anybody or necessitates people putting their back against a wall to defend themselves, but to understand that when you only have one dimension, regardless of what it is that you look at and you see, everything is going to look like a straight line. And this is all that you will be able to draw meaning from. And you won't be able to see at a deeper level. You can't see beyond race or skin color, whether someone has a scarf on their head or not, how big their beard is or the absence of a beard. That I was speaking to a woman just the other day who comes from your part of the world, and she said that she was in communication with some of her friends and people from back home, and she was trying to show them something that had a sense of beauty for her. But the people who saw what she sent to them were only able to point out what was flawed and what was lacking. And how we see things is not indicative of what we look at, but how we see things is telling us a lot about ourselves. So when you have just one dimension, everything looks like a straight line. And what our religion does is it adds another dimension at the vertical, what we call Iman, theology, our belief. And now when you have two dimensions, it starts to give shape to things. The line becomes a rectangle. It can become a diamond. You can have a circle, a square, whatever it is that you want. But when you go from this to this, it enhances for you from a vision of the eye, but also a vision of the heart, basira. And you can extrapolate more from it. You start to draw understanding and recognition of things from it. It gives you more from which you can grasp. And the third prism that it brings now on another frame, another plane, another dimension is what we call ihsan. And that's what gives us depth, that it enables us to understand that there are 360 degrees of perspective on almost an infinite number of planes through which one can see and understand things. And the husn of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he sought to instill within his companions his own innate sense of beauty inwardly, projected outwardly, had him see what he saw through his prism of vision, but could also understand why somebody saw what they saw from where they were without it having to be that he became them. And so the companions could be people who were at all levels of perspective, because perspective in and of itself wasn't meant to be understood as uniform, that there were obligations and prohibitions, but there was so much more that came from it. That the Quran has verses definitely that say don't eat pork and you shouldn't eat pork because it says don't eat pork and that's it. And a God-centric religion assumes that there are certain things that God will ask you to do that you enjoy doing, certain things that God asks you to do that are hard to do, certain things that God asks you to do that you don't really understand why you're doing it. But you would put your sense of self to the side because it's not egocentric. And you would say that Allah is asking me to, that's why I'm going to do it. But where the Quran and the Hadith do not give us an opportunity to open it up as a text, it's not going to say to me, yes, Khalid, this is who you should be married to. Yes, this is the job you should take in specific. It'll create for me an ethical framework whereby I make my decisions and my choices. And the tie now between Islam and Iman and Ihsan that comes in, that gives us a depth of perspective to draw meaning from what it is that we see, to have increase so that inwardly and outwardly we are Muslim, not just in any one direction. It's problematic if it's only inward or it's only outward. We are meant to be people who find a balance between two. What the companions had that our religion emphasizes quite deeply was a sense of accountability. That spirituality in and of itself fundamentally manifests in decision-making and choices. And an inability to be able to be comfortable with diverse experience. To have companions that come from all walks of life and all backgrounds. people who excel and people who regress and people who just plateau. People who are black, people who are white, people who are brown, people who are men, people who are women, people who are young, people who are old, people who are rich, people who are poor. You find that decision-making, choices, gives us indication how it is that we respond to our hearts. So companions known for their ferocity, like Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, still has enough of a softening within himself that over and over in his life, he sheds tears when people point out certain things to him. And he says, everybody is more knowledgeable than me. They're willing to be malleable. They're willing to be transformed. They're willing to understand where and how change becomes a much needed catalyst for inculcating transformation in the society around them. They're willing to accept one another despite what their circumstances were prior to. That everybody did not have the reputation of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. Bilal radiallahu anh, he still has to stand and call people to prayer, inclusive of those who mistreated him and abused him. People who had a fear of Abu Dhar, of the Ghafar tribe, because his tribe was known as a tribe of thieves and bandits, now had to be in spaces where they shared space together. Umar had to get used to the fact when they went to Medina that he tells the Prophet, the women here, they're not like the women in Mecca. And the Prophet consistently is telling his people about how there's latitude in this deen of ours. And it's not just rigid and myopic. And when we bring the prism of the Sahaba to us on the framework of reality, and we see where Muslim experience throughout the world has become quite about forms and externals. And it's not to leave that behind, but it has to be complemented with an understanding of what comes from the inward part to it. That's the legacy of that generation. They were in a sphere where their society was something that became just about the physical and no sense of accountability. They didn't even believe in an afterlife, let alone everything that came along with it. And so they felt comfortable just doing whatever it was they wanted to do without any qualms or hesitations. And so within our sphere of understanding, we start to bring back that recognition. And we don't tell their stories just as stories, but we aspire towards embodying that within our day-to-day. The hadith that says that Islam started as something strange. Why? This was not a society that was telling people to honor the elderly, respect orphans, treat everybody equitably, men, women, children. It spoke out against racial injustice and inequities of all kinds. It told you to visit the sick. It told you to not be abusive. It was strange based off of the standards, the norms of that time. The material wealth was not the sole purpose of one's existence. And it said, let's come together from in here, not from out here. In this world, it's really in need of similar types of interactions. We see where it is that we are so connected. A virus that starts in one part of the world can spread itself throughout everything. And there are people who are moved and motivated to be connected and to step forward and try to help. But there's also so many people who would hate the idea of being connected to people who came from certain backgrounds, certain races, certain classes, certain lineages. They don't have any desire to have any type of link to people who are different from them. The universality of Islam, the idea that there is one God for you and I, also means that there is one God for everyone, and that one God for everyone means it's for anyone. And our imperative is to start to think about where and how we can bring some of that beauty back, not just for our gain, but for the gain of people everywhere. So aspirationally, we start to break down things of inequity and oppression and injustice. That we are moved and motivated to not find comfort for ourselves first, but to understand the proportionality of this world in relation to the world beyond this one. And to see where and how that when we tell these stories of these men and women, young and old, people of distinct backgrounds, that we then find within us a courage to be outstanding ourselves. You don't want to just fall into what's typical and usual, because the second part to that hadith says that Islam began as something strange and it's going to end as something strange. And then the Prophet says, give glad tidings to the strangers. Be strange. Live your religion in pursuit of a relationship with God and find meaning through it because it's about God. And then have a willingness to accept that anybody can have that relationship with Allah. And so when you see them doing amazing things in their day-to-day, say, I want to try to be amazing too. I want to live my faith in a way where it gives me empowerment, it gives me encouragement. And I start to see where and how I relate to others. So everything that modernity comes with doesn't have us point simply a finger back at what's around us, saying, look at how bad it is. And then has us look into our books to idealize and romanticize without drawing meaning and lessons that we then implement and act upon. You see companions who are in the battlefield and they're literally thirsty in ways that you can't even imagine. And when other companions come to give them glasses of water, and they look and they see that there's others who are also about to die and they need their thirst quenched, they still give their water to someone else before quenching their own thirst in the heat of battle as they're taking their last breaths. Go and give it to them before you give it to me. And by the time they get to the other person, he has passed. And when they turn back to see the first person, he has passed. Their final acts are acts of selflessness. So what do we take from it? Not just a story to tell at a khutbah. Maybe you give up a little bit of what you have so somebody else might have it. You aspire towards having that type of heart. Because the romanticizing of what is great also makes it intangible. And the romanticizing that then denies reality makes it that much more difficult because we don't know how to deal with ourselves in our entirety and accept what we do that we do well as what we have an area of improvement upon. And the worst thing that happens is that we see people based off of our perceived shortcomings and inadequacies of them. Where again, what it is that we find, the Prophet ﷺ is able to see what is inherently good within people and bring them close from that, and then elevate them by giving them a sense of self-esteem and strength that helps them to move forward. I would encourage all of you to read about the companions of the Prophet of God ﷺ, but read them within a vision of spiritual maturity, which doesn't mean that there's immaturity. But I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and we read them stories and they learn names and dates and whatever else, and that's fine. But just like the rest of us has maturation, physically, emotionally, mentally, what I eat is quite different from what I was fed when I was born into this world. My 4-year-old eats different foods from then. He wears different clothes than when he was first born. His body has literally changed in its own ways. There's evolution to it. What he can grasp intellectually as a 4-year-old, what my daughter can grasp as a 7-year-old, is quite different from every year prior to it. Their emotional capacity has changed because of their ability to now express in language what it is that they feel. Our spiritual maturation and evolution necessitates also being able to move forward in a way where the rest of us is growing. We can't be stuck in a space where the stories are just stories. We got to draw a different meaning from them and evolve with them, because the stories don't change, but we are meant to change. And what we read from them and draw from them has to be different, because we should be becoming different. And one of the best ways, and I'll end with this because I think there's some questions in the question box here, if that's okay with you all, that I think we want to do Q&As as well. One of the things that we want to be able to do, and one of the best ways to draw meaning from these types of stories, because they're not anything about fiqh or theology. We're not creating principles of law or principles of faith. The best people to talk to each other about what these stories mean are you all talking to each other. You sit in your homes, you come together in online apparatus, and you read a story, and then you say, what do you pull from it? What did you draw from it? How did it connect to you? I sat down with some friends of mine. One is Bengali, one is African American, and we were somehow ended up talking about the story of Musa alayhi salam, Moses, peace be upon him, the prophet. My friend who's African American, he said, in my house, we love the story of Moses. Because the idea, as we are grandchildren of slaves, that an entire people under tyrannical rule and in enslavement were emancipated and set free in mass exodus, speaks to us on so many levels. And we sat and just listened to this brother talk about the parallels between the Bani Israel being an enslaved people, and where it gave him an insight into the realities of his legacy and history coming from an enslaved people. And when he finished, I said to them both that I have never heard the story of Musa alayhi salam in that way. But the way we deepen in our understanding of books, of texts, of stories, is not by having one person give a front-facing lecture and say that there's only one way to see it, but to be patient enough and excited to hear from everybody and create a space where people feel comfortable in sharing, not only when they're saying the quote-unquote most right thing or saying an avoidance, so they're not saying what's wrong, but they speak their ideas and they share their perspectives. And then we start to draw understanding about just how big this world is, because the generation of companions was able to embody so many different lived realities. But so many of our spaces tend to be quite uniform, and people having to fit in a very rigid entry point. And so you pick up a book, you take a book like Hayatus Sahaba, the stories just of the lives of the companions, and you say that this week we're going to read the story of Ali radiallahu an. We're going to hear what it was that he had going on in this life instance, and then we're going to all talk about it. We're going to try to understand what we pull from it. What did it mean to you? What did it mean to you? Have some guiding questions. Let somebody who is well-versed in facilitating facilitate so that everybody learns how to talk to each other and listen to each other. And then you grow and you deepen and you say, I've never really saw that dimension or that complexity. And you'll be able to start seeing yourself in so many of these people's lived experiences. And it'll help to bring you closer in terms of your own recognition of self, as well as your proximity to God. And if nothing else, it'll help you to better see that everybody is able to have a relationship with Allah, so that we should never become the reason as to why they now have an added obstacle that is us in their pathway. Inshallah ta'ala, it'll be something that gives us a means of strength and benefit. And so where I might be helpful to you in anything you have going on, please don't hesitate in reaching out. It would be my honor to be able to help you all. We shouldn't let physical distance be something that keeps us away from one another. But if this is the only time that we're meant to be together, then I pray, inshallah ta'ala, Allah Azza wa Jal gathers us all together again in the best of places in the world beyond this one. But please do keep me in your prayers. You and your loved ones will be in mine. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and protect us. May He bless us with knowledge that benefits us. May He bless us with the tawfiq to understand and implement that knowledge into our daily lives. May He guide and bless us all. Wallahu ta'ala alim wa billahi tawfiq. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.
Thank you, Imam, for that invigorating session. I especially liked that bit when you said how we see others says a lot about us. Right? I think that's a very important point to remember. We've got, I'm going to go straight into the questions. The first one is, you spoke about the ailments of modernity, the lack of space, loneliness, and today we have a unique type of loneliness, lack of solidarity, etc. How do we adapt ourselves and bring about a change so that we can tackle these challenges?
I mean, change in and of itself is a very subjective decision that people have to make. And I would say there's complexity as to what makes some of us quite rigid in being willing to change. But change doesn't also have to happen in a way where it's seen quite lofty, right? The Prophet ﷺ literally illustrates for us that he just has a movement of hearts. So heart upon heart being connected and engaged. And his movement exists 14 centuries later, over 1 billion strong around the world. And to understand that on a purely objective level, it's quite amazing to think about that what started very small was able to grow to such a large extent and still exist within its most authentic forms. There's not many movements that can say that they actually have that kind of reality attached to them. Beyond individual interactions, what you want to do is institutionalize things. Like you all have set up this group, the Muslim Circle, and to understand, well, how do you create a mandate that institutionalizes these types of elements to ensure that the structure in and of itself is built fundamentally from the ground up with very concrete understandings, so that what comes upon it is going to be that much bigger? Because what you start off with is going to be in the numbers that you start off with, but when you have a strategy and a plan, then 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're going to see 5 to 10 times the growth, the impact, where you have very deliberate and defined vision. What is it that you're trying to do? And then in turn, you understand what you're not doing. A mission statement to actualize that vision, and a revenue model that enables you to sustain via a financial muscle and stability the programs and services. And you come together as people who share a common vision, and you then build so that it doesn't start and end just with you, or you have to be a part of it in order for it to grow, but you can be interchangeable, and it keeps building upon itself as it moves forward. What would I say is step one? You don't have to go and stand on a street corner and try to convince people in mass, but you find 3, 4 people who buy into your vision. You sit down and you say, how are we going to change the world? You spend 6 hours, 8 hours in a room, throw up some words on a whiteboard, some large sticky note paper. You brainstorm, you're creative. You think through your skill set, your resource. Interdisciplinary mode of building is what Muslims not only need, but it's what they had before. Religious scholarship is not the sole source of leadership. Expertise in and of itself and experience is quite critical in developing robust services, programs, institutions everywhere in the world, likely where you all are too. Maybe not, but where I am, the fatwas that came out on how to bury those who are passed from COVID-19, how to stand for prayer in the midst of pandemic, you know, the closing of masajid, were not fatwa that were done simply through the prism of religious leaders and figures, but were done in consultation with public health experts, medical professionals, people who understand the dynamics of society, and they came together bringing all of their expertise and experience to the building of a structure. And you can look in parts of the world where only the quote unquote religious figures made decisions, and they decided to come together, and then their entire communities were stricken by pandemic because they were talking about things that they didn't have full knowledge of. So you all play a role. The graphic designer, the bookkeeper, the mental health specialist, the social worker, the activist, the artist, the academic, the religious leader, the scholar, whoever it is, sits down and then you build together. But that first group of people has to be able to buy into a shared vision. Probably 4 to 7 people. You get too many people in the mix and they're not team players and everybody wants things done the way that they want. It's a distraction from shaitan. You can have this much benefit and there's growth in that, but where you have capacity to have this much benefit, if he can't get you to go backwards, he's going to try to get you to do as little as you can. The people you want to work with are the people who are willing to get over themselves and they push their ego out of the way, and it's not about them, or they only partake when it's done in the way that they want it to be. But you want to work with people who know how to listen, who are trying to get to a common good. And if that is about, hey, how do we create space so that there is stillness, there is connection, that we break down loneliness, then do that. And if there's other people who say, we want to be focused on, you know, tutoring low-income kids who don't have access from privileged backgrounds for education, or we want to be focused on bringing food to the hungry, or we want to go build water wells in developing countries, that's fine. Do your thing. Be just passionate about it so that you do it whether it's convenient or inconvenient. And then do it with ihsan, with the mindset of the beneficiary involved. Because it takes very little to please your own nafs. And when you're doing to satisfy yourself, you're not going to do to the fullest extent. But when you do with real love for the people you're trying to serve, you're going to do it when things are great. You're going to do it when things are difficult, because you're going to do it just because it's the right thing to do. But you have to have patience. Day one might be that there's only 2 or 3 people that we've been able to impact. But day 10 will then have more, and year 10 will be so much more. The Prophet had a movement that necessitated going through an entire period of Mecca before he's able to go and establish what he does in Medina, come back into Mecca, and then have a movement that is found in every part of the world. That took 14 centuries. What you build will lay the seeds for a beautiful array of flowers to grow that you might not be able to benefit from their fragrance, but you will still benefit from what it is that you established, in the sense that it's what you're going to be able to carry with you. Does that make sense?
Yep, and totally inspiring, really. I know we've got a number of activists and volunteers listening in, and I'm pretty sure they've been interested in finding this answer. Can I go to the next one? Next question.
Yeah, go whatever you'd like to do. Sorry, I know I talk a lot, so just tell me.
No. All right. There are two questions, and I feel that they're interconnected. So I'm just going to make them into one. How can we learn to have an understanding of Islam beyond the one-dimension view that we have today? And does this also mean that we've sort of we're not appreciating the high objectives of Sharia and just looking at things from our own perspective?
I mean, it could be, right? But I think it's still, look, you can't give something to somebody that you don't possess in the first place, right? So if all I have is practice, then that's what I'm going to have. That's not a bad thing. And I think one of the things that comes with spiritual maturation, religious maturation, is to not confine things purely in the prism of good and bad, right and wrong, because validation doesn't then come from having to be correct all the time. You adopt a growth mindset that acknowledges with confidence your God-given skills and talents, as well as where you have areas to improve. A fixed mindset rooted in arrogance or whatever it's rooted in, but arrogance has you just see what's weak in people around you, and that's just through your perception. A fixed mindset keeps you stuck, it paralyzes you because you don't believe there's room to grow or room to change, and that comes from complexity in our socialization. But where people have given to us what we've taken from them, that's what we believe religion to be. So if somebody says, well, how do I move beyond that? You move beyond it by just going and learning elsewhere and understanding from elsewhere. If somebody converted in your local town and they said to you, teach them Islam, what would you give to them as a litmus test? That at the end doesn't have to be something you go announce to people, but in order to understand how you reach a goal, you have to know where you actually stand in relation to it. So you can map out a trajectory specific to you, not somebody else, because nobody's standing where you stand. They literally cannot stand on the spot that you're standing on because you're already standing on it. How can somebody be where you are when you are there? And so you start to think about where it is and you reflect. And so I would say, pull out a notebook. I don't know where. I have a notebook that I have next to me all the time. You write down a question and then you reflect in your book. That's why the word for reflection in Arabic is fikr, and the word for notebook is mufakkir, that it's the place that you do your fikr in, you reflect into it. So I would say write down. You want to know where you're at in relation to faith? If somebody converted tomorrow and you were then commissioned to teach them Islam, what would you teach them? And could you tell them anything other than prayer and fasting? Would you say to them what your experience is and, hey, your name, you should probably change it because of mechanics? Where most names are Islamic, they don't have to be Arabic to be Islamic. But to understand, again, you can only give what you have. And then after some time, it would get exhausted. And you would sit down and you would think, what do I really have of this religion? It is so deep and it is so beautiful. And what I have is an entry point, but I haven't really had so much more than that. And because there's a diminishing of certain practices, contemplation, reflection, meditation, to just think. Everybody thinks, let me clarify. But what we want is to embrace our liberty to choose how we think, what we think about, and to also choose what it is that we're thinking about in the first place. And where we have paradoxical understandings of many things, in choice, there is so many paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes of choice is that when you don't make a choice, you have made a choice. And if what you're taking is unconsciously understood of religion and faith, and you have allowed for yourself to believe that it's just what you had as its entry point of mechanics, mechanics are not leading you to something. You can now say, this is where I am. And then there's so much that you could do to learn from people who have this training, but to also grow it at a pace that makes sense for you. his reflection, contemplation, absorption of what's taking place around you requires like a muscle that, just like your physical body takes time to grow and increase in strength, so too your mental and spiritual muscles will take time. And if you could focus for a minute on one day, but after a week you get to 2 minutes, that's growth. You get to 5 minutes after a month, there's growth in that. You start to then look in our texts and you start to embody what it says. You focus on your diet. You see what you consume through all of your organs of sensory perception. You again, and this is just my opinion, be comfortable at writing things down and say, how did this experience feel to me from the standpoint of just simply what I was hearing? How did it experience itself from what I saw, from what I smell? You literally have feelings and memories that get evoked when you smell the perfume of a loved one who is no longer in your life. When you are in interaction with scents of food that's cooked that reminds you of things that your mother might have cooked for you when you were a child. Or if you've ever had a baby in your life, regardless of how old you get and how old your kids are, you pick up somebody else's baby and they have that baby smell, it takes you back to the time that you had a baby. The memory is not attached to that's not even your kid. You might not have ever met the kid. But the scent enough brings you emotional reaction, mental reaction. What Allah gave to you and I that made us distinct from the rest of creation was the ability to think. This is why we have accountability for choices, because we have aql, we have the process to discern right and wrong. And so you start to engage books in that way. You have patience with yourself. Ours is a religion that's about the process more so than the destination. And if you set out to try to get to a goal and you don't make it, just get up and start again. And if you leave this world before you get to it, that's okay. At least you started, and Allah is going to see that you started, but you start in a way. You don't leave behind the mechanics. It's very important because they are a spiritually identified and defined mode of movement forward. And I know I'm talking a lot. This is the last thing I'll say. One of the things you want to reflect on, or two things. You're in Ramadan, you want a starting point, I would say take a notebook and write at the end of it, what does success look like for me in terms of Ramadan? Who should I be at the conclusion of 30 days of Ramadan? And you start to then work your way backwards. You take your steps backwards and say, what do I need to do to get to that place of success? The second thing that I would tell you that you should prompt to reflect upon, who is God to me? The Hadith Qudsi is very clear. أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنِّ عَبْدِي بِي. The Prophet ﷺ says that Allah says, I am as my servant thinks I am. And again, paradoxically, if you have not chosen to be deliberate in your perspective on who Allah is, not some rote memorization. My 4-year-old, I could bring him in here, he could recite Surah Ikhlas to you perfectly, mashallah. He belts it out when we're on the subway, he screams it sometimes in the bathtub, sometimes he's on the toilet, and I say, Kareem, can't do that, man. He knows the words, he's 4. The meanings are not necessarily what he needs right now or what he will grasp, but I am much older than him. If I'm stuck just in the memorization, that is not my understanding of who Allah is to me. Do you believe in a God that the Prophet Abraham believed in, that fed him and gave him drink, that heals him whenever he is ill? Do you believe in a God that when the Prophet tells you to be steadfast in the face of difficulty, to have istiqamah, says, قُلْ أَمَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ, is what the Quran and the Hadith says. ثُمَّ اسْتَقِمْ, that you're saying to yourself, I believe in God. And then I'm going to stand and face any challenge. Because the God I believe in is the most merciful of those who show mercy, the most gentle, the most kind, the source of an unconditional love. The one who, when no one else is with me, he is with me. The one who doesn't just watch me, but watches over me. That before there was anything, there was him, and after there is nothing, there will be him. When the entire world is asleep and doesn't know the pain that I'm going through, my God does not ever slumber. He is always awake, watching over me. He does not need the sustenance and provision of anyone else to be able to provide what he provides for me. Do you believe in a God that believes in you? You sit down and you just reflect, who is Allah to me? You might have some hesitation in the beginning. You might say, am I allowed to do this? What is it about allowance? You're not going and telling everybody else anything. You can if you want to. But if everything comes back to God, and you have not made a depiction of God for yourself, that he himself is saying, Ana inda dhanni abdi bi, I am as my servant thinks I am. Not consciously yielding to that process doesn't mean that you still do not have a conceptualization of God. And many of us believe in a God that's an angry old man in the sky looking for a reason to punish us. But when you read the Quran, you read the Hadith, you see a very different picture. I would say, write it down at the top of a book. Whatever language you speak most fluently, who is God to me? And then revisit the question, come back to it over and over. And you start to build, in a sense, experientially. Ihsan is not rotely memorized. It is lived. It is experienced. You sit at the end of the day, you engage in your muhasabah, your reflection. What did this day bring to me? And what will tomorrow bring to me? And you start to then act upon virtues and values. Increase in patience by being patient. Increase in kindness by being kind. Increase in generosity by being generous. And let your heart awaken from this, and it'll start coming back to the actual engagement of the deepening beyond the mechanics.
Oh, another powerful answer from you, Imam. One more question. Have you got time? How much time have you got?
I'm just sitting locked in my house, so
Right.
I got the time that you guys
So
have.
are we over here? All right. Now the next one. How do you overcome bias from baggage that's political, socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, lineage, etc.? It exists in people's decisions and views, and it usually affects our actions as well. So how do you overcome these biases?
I mean, the first step in overcoming bias, in my opinion, is one, to acknowledge that you have it, and two, to understand it through, I would say, a sociological perspective rather than purely understanding it through spiritual and religious terminologies. Sociologically, we are in a sphere where our interactions with one another draw us to similarity and familiarity. It's not a good or a bad, but we tend to draw a sense of self by being around people who are just like us. Our sense of comfort is not thrown off when you are different from me and I somehow think there's something wrong with you alone, but because you're being different from me agitates me, and I think deeply about why, is because I don't know how to be me unless you are just like me. That my assurance comes from places of externals rather than internals. Stereotyping is a cognitive function. Everybody does it. It's not just a good or a bad, it's just a thing. And sometimes it's helpful because it creates buckets of knowledge that when you see something, it evokes an understanding. So my son, when he learns that red means stop, now when he sees red, it means stop. Green means go. Green means go. You can have stereotypes of all kinds that have you in certain moments, right? I'm not the largest human being in the world. You might not be able to tell because we're on a camera, but if I was standing and we wanted to play basketball, some of you would likely pick everybody other than me because I'm 5'3", and you're just going to assume from a stereotype that he's not good, which I'm not good. You should not pick me. But it starts to build itself as a cognitive function. Stereotypes come to us now, though, not just from our own direct socialization, they come to us from so much of what we're bombarded with. And how we perceive others is not necessarily from spending time with them, but we still nonetheless have spent time with stereotypes of them. And there is psychology to this, and people know it. And you would think that, no, like, why would people do it? It's not conspiracy-esque. People who want you to buy what they're selling, they have tons of psychologists on their staff so that they can create products and advertisements to cater to you as their mass consumer market, because they want you to believe that happiness is attached to you buying what it is that they're selling to you. You ever see a commercial with somebody eating food and they look miserable, or wearing clothes from a certain place and they look just so sad? No, they all look so happy and they're having so much fun. And the people that are there of certain races, certain skin colors, certain backgrounds, how they dress, how they do not dress, all play into what it is that is socializing your image, the presence of certain people, but their absence. And then you think about what you see on TV, what it is that you see in magazines, what you hear when you listen to different parts of the arts and music and other things. And then you recognize that there's a synergy between corporations, media, and governmental apparatus that understands the value in keeping us separate from each other. And where we can then be in spaces where our contact with one another is not attached to our direct interaction, but just with the narratives that are constructed and imposed upon us of the other that leverages things like fear and anxiety. What would somebody need to look like for you to not be there for them? Just think about it. Who are the type of people who will never be invited to eat in your home? What does somebody have to look like for you to perhaps lock the door on your car when they are passing by, or hold your bag or purse closer to you on a bus or on a train? The paradoxical nature of the self is that we learn about it through it. And you are the best teacher of who it is that you are in your most current state. Where you can start to see now that there becomes interaction as a much needed basis for breaking these stereotypes down. Decades ago, there was a social experiment done by a man named Muzaffar Sharif. And he took two groups of young boys, 12 years of age, all from the same race and background and class, and they were put into a campsite. And they didn't know that either group was there. They had a lot of fun, and they gave themselves their own like group names. One was called the Rattlers and one was called the Eagles. They played sports and swam and did all kinds of things. And then some days into it, unbeknownst to them that they were in a social experiment, they were told that there's another group on the campsite. Same age, doing the same things. And immediately both groups, inwardly, having not met each other, started to speak poorly about one another. They make assumptions of each other. They speak quite ill of each other. And as they now slowly start to be brought into spheres of interaction, they've already created conceptualizations of one another rooted in negative frames, negative stereotypes, negative preconceived ideas and notions. They start to vandalize each other's bunks, cabins where they're staying. They start to be quite harsh with one another. The camp then creates a competition. And in the competition, there's so much more at stake than just winning. They don't want to lose to the other in this frame of negativity. And you see the animosity in 12-year-olds is quite high, just from being together but separate for weeks, and the initial interaction they have with each other cognitively, not even in person. And then they start to bring them together and orchestrate opportunities for them to work together in meaningful ways. A truck breaks down at the campsite and they have to build it back up together. There's a water leakage, there's other things. But the more they start to spend time together, they see that there's similarity. And it develops sociologically a theory that's called contact theory that has you build by being together. You start to interact, and that starts to lay the seeds of love. And this is where, like, my country is a great example that they purposely stratify through things like slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration. They segment who lives where and who does not get to live where, so there's not interactions, and you literally don't get to see how Black people are treated because you live in your white privilege bubble that the government has given you over here, and these people live over here, and there's no interaction. And then they build out TV shows like Cops so that you reinforce stereotypes of politicians using words like thug and predator in their political campaign, and concocting a war on drugs that validates usually white men in blue police uniforms arresting Black people on national television, on TV shows like Cops, to reinforce stereotypes. The word for love in Arabic in its most generic form is hub, mahabba. There's about 12 different ways to say love, and it gets drilled down very specific, but the most general form is hub, mahabba. The word for seed in Arabic is habba. And it has the same root letters. And in Arabic, when words share common roots, they then tend to have kind of a thread in their meanings. So the relationship between hub, love, and habba, seed, is that you can't rear anything from a seed by just throwing it in the earth. It needs nurture, care, cultivation. You have to spend time with it. The beauty of a seed is that when you engage it and give it its due right, it never gives you just a seed back. It always gives you much more than that. You can't love somebody if you don't spend time with them. You definitely can't love them if you only spend time with stereotypes of them. And you're never going to be able to do anything if you don't admit your own stereotypes. Some of you think certain things about other people, and it's crazy. You can think something about someone that you have never met before. SubhanAllah. And I would say this to you because I think it's very important. And I said it, I think, when we were talking before. Shaitan's act that throws him out of Jannah is his arrogant act of racism. He's the first racist. And he's been doing this from day one. He's given the opportunity to sway and draw us away from what Allah wants from us. Allah is most just. May Allah make us from amongst those who enter his Jannah without any judgment. But to understand that when we stand in front of him, Shaitan can fully say that, Ya Allah, you cast me out of paradise for doing the same thing that they did. Why are you going to let them in? You don't want that ugly arrogance in your heart that's tied to racism or things that are rooted in xenophobia of any kind. And you see where inequity and oppression is there. There's reason why the Palestinians are in blockades and they're literally behind walls. You can see propaganda machines going all over the place. There's reasons why the government of Myanmar talks about the Rohingya in the ways that they do. And you have individuals that honestly believe that the Rohingya are actually the cause of their own demise. It comes from these synergies and the education we're exposed to, the media we consume, the stories that corporations and government want us to believe, so that we believe the thoughts that we think are our own thoughts, but it's a product of supremacy that is globalized. That supremacy wants you to believe that you're thinking your own thoughts, but in reality, the thoughts that you think are the thoughts that they want you to think. And it just allows for the perpetuation of inequity because we are rendered passive in breaking down what we have capacity to do because we somehow believe it's okay that certain people get treated. Or even if we think that it's not okay, we don't get to the place that we're willing to have it be at a cost to us to help them. It's just kind of rhetoric. So go spend some time virtually. You know what's amazing right now about this pandemic? You're talking to me and I'm in New York City. You could close this and you could go and jump on virtual gatherings of any masjid in the world right now. You want to go spend time with Black people? Go and hop on to a Zoom that is from a predominantly African American masjid. You want to know what it's like for Turkish people, Albanians? You want to know what it's like for people who are sitting in the middle of Palestine, people who are in Syria? You want to know what refugee experience is like? You have an opportunity now to just go sit and listen and adopt empathetic listening. So you're listening to understand, not listening to respond or reply. And you become in a space where you acquainted and you break down the stereotypes by actually being with people as best as you can. And it'll take time, but I would say as a last point that it's really great if you can acknowledge your own microaggressions and stereotypes. Because most people will fight on end to say that there's nothing racist in me. And when you are able to admit it, you then start to break it down and dismantle it, inshallah.
Thank you again for that answer. Now, one more question. Can you elaborate on living like a stranger, the hadith that you quoted earlier? Does this mean we don't fight for our haqq and leave all the matter to Allah?
I mean, I don't know what the haqq is that you're trying to fight for. And I would just say, I'm not of the opinion that, you know, gatherings that are like this, that exist virtually, the Prophet ﷺ knew his companions quite deeply, to the extent that when people ask questions, he was able to give distinct answers to the same questions because the people who were asking them were different. And so it really depends on what it is that you are seeking to establish and reinstill as a right within your own existence and life. If somebody is holding you down in some way, ours is not a system that is acquiescent to inequity by any means. The Prophet's movement was not to adopt a good Muslim, bad Muslim framework that took cues from the Meccan elite as to how to be. But he spoke out against their most atrocious practices. There was still strategy, though, and mindfulness, because the goal was to not just appease one's own righteous anger and silence frustration, but to bring about real change. And so you sit down and you think out, well, how do we counter this? Organized evil will always triumph over disorganized righteousness. That's truth. Where there are people who don't want to relinquish power and they don't want to let it go, they will capitalize on an absence of organization from amongst those who have good intentions and they have good motivations, but they haven't sat down to put in the time to figure out how to do it in a very strategic way. And so where the Prophet ﷺ is saying in this hadith, and this is not absolute interpretation, but what, you know, commentators make on it and what our teachers tell us about it is that Islam was different from what it was that people were doing in that time frame. They literally were treating people very terribly, like just garbage. A prophet was not sent to a people other than to bring them back to a way of certain living. And usually the case that we find is that there were peoples who were adopting really abhorrent practices that needed to now have a reminder that said, this is not the way to be. And so early on, the people who became Muslim were from the lower social classes, the people who were not of the noble lineage, people who were slaves, they were poor. And it was something that was seen as quite strange. That why are you telling us to suddenly start treating women well, to start treating slaves well, to not have slaves at all, to limit how it is that we take advantage of certain things, to have more ethics in our practice and our behavior? Why do you think there's hadith, for example, that the Prophet ﷺ is telling his people that you need to pay your laborer before the sweat from their brow drips onto the ground? He's giving them business ethics. Why do you think the Prophet ﷺ is telling people to not waste water within the performance of wudu? He's giving them a sense of what indulgence is and environmental ethics. Why is the Prophet telling stories of individuals who were known to be committers of zina, and giving water to a thirsty dog became enough for them to have forgiveness and mercy from God and entrance into paradise? He's helping them to understand Allah's mercy, but he's also telling them, take care of animals. There's so much that goes into what the Prophet ﷺ is giving to us that can have layers of meaning that we draw from it, that at that time was most strange. People are not going to be in a sphere where they have difficulty understanding conceptually what Islam calls itself towards. They're going to just want to understand why you would do it. Like, why wouldn't you just satisfy your own nafs? Why don't you just do something because it feels good? Why don't you just spend your money on temporary satisfaction, on yourself? Do the things that give you a rise in whatever your ego is calling you towards. And they're not asking it in a way to be mean or offensive. That's just the way the society functions. When you have the modern day shirk that is supremacy, that elevates and idolizes the ego to such an extent that it's telling you to be subservient to it, and you put your wants over everyone else's needs, people are going to wonder, why would you spend your weekend working in a food pantry or soup kitchen? Why would you take your vacation time and go and do relief work in a refugee camp? Why would you not have a vacation at all and just save your money and give it to somebody who's more in need? Why do you have your elders live in your house? Why do you visit the sick? And they're asking because that's not the way the society around them has really said you should be. It requires the consumer to be what is first. And in the framework of our role, we can either be a consumer or a contributor. You can have a blend of them, but Islam says be more of a contributor than a consumer. And even if you're a consumer, don't ever be a parasite that just leeches and takes what you want. And so the strangeness is to understand that you want to be somebody who is guided by ethics and morals. If we were to strip our names away from us, if I was not Khalid anymore, but I was known by my most prevalent characteristic, would I be known as a character that was greed or selfishness? Would I be known as mercy or compassion, honesty? Or would I be known as untruthful? And the formulaic patterns of success that we get indoctrinated with, that tell us, go to school, get a degree, get married, have some kids, like do this, do that. Maybe when you're older, you could figure out this other stuff. That's not what Islam says. Islam calls itself to a deep beauty and tells people to engage in the yielding of disseminating beauty by recognizing their own beauty and to try to live with beauty both outwardly and inwardly. What a lot of society offers to us is a very superficial understanding. You can't even go out and tell people when you're sad, because what would people think? You can't go out and just be real honest with your feelings, because somebody else will become uncomfortable. People don't know how to adopt a sense of care. And the few who do, they do get valorized and elevated. There's a reason why there's a virality to instances where people are selfless and upstanding. But that should be the norm, is what Islam says. And it says it's strange in the beginning, and it's saying it's strange at the end, because with modernity, there's going to be that lack of depth of perspective. People will see with simplicity. They won't be able to really attach meaning to it. It'll take very little to sway us to justify certain things. In my country right now, I mean, just imagine this. In my country right now, there are people who are protesting, and they want to go out and be back in the markets and in their place of work. And they know, consequently, the president has literally gotten on TV and said that there will be an acknowledged series of deaths of people whose immunity is compromised. But they see it as a necessary loss so that these other people can go back and just do what it is that they want to do. And maybe it's my country that's just terrible, but you see that they don't care about Black people getting shot. They don't care about kids in schools getting shot. They don't care about the elderly dying from the pandemic just so they can go and do what it is that they want to do for their own selves. Islam does not tell us to be like that. We don't put ourselves at the center and say that everything else revolves around us. We put Allah at the center. We understand that Allah is at the center of everything, which means then our connectivity is through overlapping spheres of interconnectivity. And that our aspiration is not individualism or independence, but the highest level of self-actualization comes from an embracement of interdependence, where and how what we do bears impact on others. And the world just doesn't think in that way. But Muslims are supposed to be different. We see with not just here, but we also see from here. And we see how we fit in. And even if nobody else is doing right, we do right because it's the right thing to do. So you are hospitable, and you are kind, and you are compassionate. You go and follow the values and virtues that the tradition tells us to. And you start to be that source of hope for people. Even when it's strange, people will say, why? And you just say, because that's what God wants me to do. And it's enough to motivate me to do it. But again, I don't know what it is that you have that has been lost in your life. And I pray that, inshallah ta'ala, Allah restores it to you and does so without causing harm to anyone. If someone is oppressing you, then may Allah grant them wisdom and understanding and keep them from being an oppressor. Somebody is hurting or abusing you, do not let yourself be in a place where you are abused or hurt. And may Allah make us from amongst the best of your supporters so that you don't have to go through it by yourself. But not knowing what it is, I can't speak to the specificity of what it is that you have going on.
Can you take 3 more questions?
Yeah, sure.
All right. How can you figure out that Allah wants you to do something and you're capable of doing it, as in human agency meeting divine will?
How can you know that you're capable of doing something?
Something comes your way, right? Something comes your way. So how do you know whether you're capable of what Allah's brought to you?
You know that you're capable by doing what it is that you do. Like, so it might sound very obvious, and I'm not trying to be obnoxious, right? But you know what you can do by doing the thing, if that makes sense. Like the vehicle through which one increases in a certain value usually is the value itself being the vehicle. And so how you know you have capacity is by going through the process. Ours is not a religion that we raise our hands to the skies and suddenly faith just pours into us. But it creates a process through which we act, and then at the end of it, there is what we get only by having gone through the process that yields it for us, right? كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Fasting was written for you, so as it was written for those who came before you, so that perhaps you might attain taqwa. But in order to get the taqwa that verse talks about, it doesn't just say, give me taqwa, but you go through the fasting that then will render taqwa. The experience is what yields you what it is that you're looking for. I'll give you an example. When we came to Malaysia last time, with my family, I think I came after that on my own, but when we were in Malaysia, my daughter and my son and my wife and I were there, and my son turned 1. We went to Singapore for a day, and he turned 1 in Singapore. He's 1 year old. He's crawling on the floor, not walking. And we were having lunch in a food court in one of the shopping centers in Kuala Lumpur, that there's a Kentucky Fried Chicken, or at least there was back then. I don't know if there still is now, but just so you can picture it in your head. And my wife and my daughter went to go eat something healthy, and I took my son to get some fried chicken. And as we're walking, he's crawling on the floor. He gets to a place where there's a ramp that is not a big ramp, but say we're here and the next step is right here, the ramp just goes down a little bit. But my son has never seen a ramp before in his life. He's literally turning 1 while we are there in this place. And we live in Manhattan in New York City. Elevators, skyscrapers, there's not ramps, people don't take stairs. And so he doesn't know what this is. And not knowing what it is becomes a difficulty for him, which is principle number 1. Most of us don't have a challenge in acknowledging that we'll have difficulty in our lives. What throws us off is that we don't expect the difficulty to look the way that it does. And then it catches us off guard and we don't know what to do. It doesn't mean we don't have capacity to do, but our initial processing is one in a frame of unfamiliarity, that you are in a state of stability, conflict comes in, you look to your natural coping methods to get back to homeostasis, but when it doesn't work, you then have one of 2 options. You look for new methods to get here, and that's good. Or what most people do is they just sit here and say, there's no way out of this. My son now gets to this ramp and he doesn't know what to do because he's never seen it before. And it's so fascinating to see young kids learn like the names of things, the meanings of things, and to reflect just on why you might see something the way that you do, because of when you were a kid, you were taught something in a certain way also. So he looked to me, and I'm probably a bad father, and I did not pick him up and carry him down, but I just looked back at him. And so he then said to himself, let me try to figure this out. And he turned around so that his feet are what is touching the ramp, not his hands. And he takes one of his feet and puts it on the ramp and then takes it back and does that maybe 6, 7 times until he gets comfortable. And then he takes his other foot and puts it on the ramp and does the same thing. And then slowly he starts to just push his way down on the ramp. And it takes him like a good while, but he's a baby and he's never done this before. And then when he gets to the end of it, all of the fear turns into real exhilaration. And he looks at me with a smile on his face. And then he just starts going up and down this ramp that's on the floor in the basement food court of this mall in Kuala Lumpur. Because why not? He's done it. Just do it some more. And then we move forward and we get to a staircase sometime after we've done eating. And he tries to now just climb up the staircase. His strength is unbounded at that point, his courage. But you got to understand that the courage that Kareem needed to go up and down the ramp only came from going up and down the ramp. And it was not something that was conditional, but it gave him so much courage. he immediately thought he could take on a bigger challenge. And so how you know is that you bring yourself to it. But the version of yourself that you bring is what's going to be critical. Ritual does not change in our religion. God does not change. He is ghani. He is free of need. He doesn't change. The purpose of certain things is to not transform necessarily that which is external, but to be transformative within. And as we get older, we become a little bit more set in where we're at. Psychological studies highlight and show that difficulty, traumatic experience at times becomes statistically what is needed for somebody to become open to change in their life. May Allah protect us from being people that need that kind of reality to change. But to understand now when the thing is in front of you, where and how you approach it is what's going to be important. And self-care becomes critical at this time. You have a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual sphere to yourself. The utilization of energy does not render weakness, but if you don't have a deliberate process through which you replenish strength after you have expended it, you're going to bring tired versions of yourself to what it is you have going on. And the challenge is going to seem that much more inundating. Perseverance is not that you meet something head on and you keep going. Perseverance is what kicks in after you are so tired from doing what you've been doing, and then you still keep going. You persevere once the exhaustion sits in, but you do so on your own terms. Some difficulties are not going to be easy to overcome, not because of the difficulty, but because of an absence of self-awareness. The Quran tells us that of our human condition is that we're hasty. And we want everything done right away, right in the moment, as opposed to gathering ourselves and recognizing what it is that we bring to the situation. What do you do to replenish your physical strength? What are your outlets for your own emotional wellness and mental wellness, your spiritual wellness? And when you're running on empty, do you have the patience to just sit back and say, now is not the time to act or move? Most of us get bombarded. The two questions I ask people that I'm comfortable as a generalization making, which I usually am not, because you are a specific person. You have your own heart. You are not somebody else. But a generalization that I'm comfortable making is two questions that I ask people quite often that I get the answer of I don't know to is one, I say, what are your values? What guides your moral philosophy and compass? And they say when they're really open and vulnerable, I don't know. And the second I say is, what are your outlets? How do you take care of your heart? And they say, I don't know. If you are not designing your life, somebody else will design it for you. And they will want you to fit into what it is that yields for them. Companies that build daycares in their facilities are not necessarily helping you out. They're just taking away an excuse for you to be away from work because you have children. And they said, well, just bring your children here so you could work more. If in the course of your day, you don't have in your calendar time for your own wellness, which is not selfish, you cannot take care of other hearts if you are not taking care of your own heart. Then you're going to get tired, and that tiredness is what you're going to bring. And now here's the problem, and here's you, and you're going to see the problem, but in a prism of exhaustion, you're going to see it only in a myopic way. And you're going to bang your head against it over and over, hoping it's going to fall. It won't. You will. And you're going to say, I can't do this anymore. I can't tell my parents anymore I want to marry the person that they don't want me to. I can't anymore deal with not working the life that they don't want me to. I can't confront all of these things. Organically, you'll get some strength back. But you probably just try to do the same thing that you did before. It ain't worked the first 20 times. Why would it work now? All you're doing is hurting your head with what you want to do. And this is how you want information to tie in together, not be separated. Things can be seen from 360 degrees of perspective. So don't take the strength that you get and try to do the same thing again. Take the strength that you get and move this way. So you now see it differently, and you can approach it differently, and you can engage it differently. The Prophet ﷺ says that the believer is not stung from the same hole twice. You put your hand in a hole and a scorpion bites you, fine, you didn't know. But you put your hand back in the hole again and it bites you again, that's on you. That's not on the scorpion. Why are you doing it? You knew it was there. You take time to breathe, relax, get your faculties back in store. Most things don't have to happen right away. Sleep well, eat well. Another generalization I'm comfortable making. Your physical wellness is attached to your overall wellness and spirituality. You want to come say hi?
Hi.
This is my son, Kareem.
Yes, Kareem.
Assalamualaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Kareem, you remember your Azra Khala? We went to her house in Malaysia so long ago. You remember? You were just a little
That's
baby.
right.
And this is Medina. You want to come say hi? Say assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
I'm going to finish in 2 minutes, okay? And then you can take it. Guys, should we go back to Malaysia soon? You look so pretty, my baby. You remember when we went to Azra Khala's house in Malaysia? You don't? You might have been sleeping that night. It was pretty late. But you see what I'm saying, right? Like, it's not that the difficulty becomes overwhelming. And so surround yourself with good people. You want to talk to people, have a space of self-expression. Who do you go to speak with that doesn't jump to tell you what to do? But again, they listen to understand. They create a space where you can voice your thoughts and you can think about what you're thinking about. And the tiredness and exhaustion doesn't get so cluttered with so many other people saying, do this, do that, do this, do that. And it just builds and builds and builds. And then it's a vision modifier, right? If my goal is here and I am here, but I literally have an obstacle in the way that let alone keeps me from reaching it, doesn't even allow for me to see it. And I'm not even acknowledging that this is here. Internally, it comes in my way. And it builds itself up over time. It's going to make it hard. It doesn't have to be a religious scholar again. I say this as a person who's in a religious role. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. Objective voices that you could talk things out with, who let you just put it out there and they carry a little bit of the heaviness you have, so you're not carrying it alone. And then they create space for you to just rest. And then you revisit things through a different prism. Ramadan is a great example of this because the Prophet ﷺ, he would engage in i'tikaf, solitude that he would seek that would help him to better understand the circumstances he found himself in, and more so what his role was within it. But he's consuming just positivity for 10 days in a row. Negativity through all of his sensory organs is just suspended. And he's in a sphere where he's able to be transformed. None of the prophets of God, none of these luminaries engaged without a regular practice of solitude. And it wasn't about being away from people, but about being away from distractions. And then they always came back. And the world was different to them, not because it changed, but they now had distinct change and they could see it differently. And then there's going to be certain things that, yes, will be hard to do, but the opportunity to come to a place of confidence in saying that this might not be the time. It might not be that you can't ever do it, but right now is not the time to push it, still will give a sense of assurance that you come to that decision and not your emotion if you're engaging in the self-care practices along the way to keep yourself balanced throughout it.
That brings us very nicely into the penultimate question, self-care. There's a lot of self-love, self-healing that's going on these days. How do we balance that, right? That you got to love yourself, you got to take care of yourself, you got to worship yourself. Balance that with what's expected of us as Muslims so that we don't turn into selfish creatures, self-centered creatures. This question is exactly, it's actually directed to women and girls so that women and girls don't turn into self-centered people, but I think it applies across the board to everyone.
Yeah, not knowing who it is that asked the question, maybe you all know, so I won't, it's not, the ego is not something that exists in a gender specified way. it's a gender neutral, concept, right? Your soul, your heart, your jasad, your body. Like there's elements to us that make us who it is that we are from a Islamic paradigm standpoint. You have your physical body, what we call the jasad, the badan. It's your physical being. You have the nafs, the ego. You have the qalb, the heart, the spiritual heart. You have the ruh, the soul. You have the aql, the intellectual capacity to discern right from wrong, but from the prism of what God deems to be right and wrong, not moral relativism, not a nafsi understanding. Then you have what we call irada, just your sheer will and determination. And these elements are what make us who we are in our entirety. And the uniqueness of the circumstance is that so much of the world is driven by the self, but not so much is then put into understanding the self. We live in a world that teaches us to look at ourselves, but not for ourselves. And we're in a sphere where the instruction that we're given is not beyond our ability to grasp or harness, but we don't aspire towards that. Language becomes really important. And your perception of a term doesn't mean that that's what it actually means. And so self-love is very different from a love of the self. And that's not meant to be something that's cute or clever, but they're two different phrases. Your self-love will allow for you to feel emboldened and recognize what it is that you have and that you are something worthy of love, that you then go out now and share that with others. A love of the self has you just engage in practice that is your own self-interest. And so you start to attach meaning to things by diversifying the terminologies, and you don't exert kind of a hodgepodge that sticks it all together. You can't be in a space where you are able to care for others if you don't care for you. How will you be able to do that? If you are running on empty all the time, if you are not taking time for your own wellness, retreat, practice, your prophet spent 10 days in Ramadan in isolation from everybody. What do you think he's doing there, if not rejuvenating himself? If you've ever done i'tikaf, you know what the experience is like. You literally walk out of the masjid, you literally walk out of the spiritual retreat, and everything just feels different. I remember the first time I did i'tikaf, and I left from the masjid, and I walked out of it, and the first time I heard someone yell at somebody, have an argument, it like hurt my inside so much. And I had to say to them, like, can you please stop? Like it does not feel good. And it made me think about the hadith very differently, where the Prophet ﷺ comes out to tell people when Laylatul Qadr is, and there's two men quarreling. They don't name the men in the hadith because that's not the point of the hadith, but they're quarreling, they're negative that they interject into the world at that time. The Prophet ﷺ says, I came to share this knowledge with you, but that knowledge has now been lifted because of these two people quarreling in this way. And you then hear from him and he says, look within the nights of the last 10 nights and the odd nights for it, but there's not definitiveness to it. That the interjection of an act then creates consequently a reaction, a catalyst, right? That's why we follow bad deeds with good ones, to reinstate balance. And we want to be imbalanced in the frame of positivity, not negativity. And so you start to go through self-development, self-actualization, self-growth, which are all good things. But to be in a place where self-care takes on a connotation of selfishness is deeply problematized. If you believe that somehow you cannot have a time for your own growth and your own wellness, you're likely going to open the door for bitterness and resentment to come in. You're going to be in a place where you have burnout syndrome, which happens to a lot of Muslims who are community leaders, activists, engage in whatever kind of work. They just get inundated with it. You need spaces that are to breathe. If you are an activist and your 10, 12 hours of the day is spent in activism, and then the people you hang out with are also your activist friends, and then at the end of the day, you're hanging out and you're just talking more about activism. And so 24/7, that's what you're doing. You go paint a picture, go for a jog, right? Cook something, read a book, take a break so that you can still replenish yourself. And you can also draw meaning from other spaces. Your outlets don't have to be things that fall under other suits. As long as you're not doing something to hurt you or hurt someone else, not doing something haram, it can be anything. But it becomes necessary. And it's one of the things that drives society, the self right now, in a way that is quite problematic. What Shaitan has done is create a system that indulges the self to such an extent. You likely can do this in Malaysia. I can do it in New York City, even in the midst of pandemic. I can go down the street and I can order a coffee. I got to take it to go, but they will make it to my exact specification and even write my name on the cup of coffee because it's so catered to my nafs. But yourself in its entirety is not just your nafs. You have your badan, your jasad, your physical self. You have your qalb, your spiritual heart. You have your aql, your intellect. You have your ruh, your soul. You have your irada, your sheer will and determination. Learn about those things if you're not comfortable about learning about the nafs, and then come to the nafs later. But you understand its functionality and you pay attention to it. And you ask yourself questions, right? We're not a people who are without process and logic. You don't want to just believe you're a robot and you have a button that says, now I'm happy and now I'm sad. But if something makes you angry, the number of people who have reached out to me that say, I feel terrible, I'm fasting and I yelled at my parent, and now I just think I'm the worst and I don't want to do this and that and this, which is fine. Don't yell at your parents. But what you want to do in the process of self-awareness is, again, pull out the book, write it down, and try to understand, why did you get angry? Not just do not get angry, but to understand that you land on it for different reasons. A lot of people express anger because of sadness. It just comes out that way. You can't control emotions in that sense, but you control the actions and decisions that yield the manifestation of certain emotions. And you just think about it. And that's what we mean when we say self-reflection, because you learn about you through you. You want to stop the experience from happening, then you start to ask the question of why, and then you answer it. Why do I get so upset about the things that I do? Why do these people annoy me so much? Why do these people not annoy me? Why was I able to go and donate so much or volunteer so much? Why was I able to do certain things when I was younger that I don't do when I'm older anymore? Your mind and your heart do not have the capacity to determine reality themselves. They believe what is real based off of what you tell them is real. And when you give just absolute reason as to why you might land on a certain behavior, and you don't see that there's complexity that brings itself into the situation, you then don't remedy things because you don't see what the entirety of it is. You take time, just spend some time with yourself, but it will be part of the process of reaching a higher pinnacle in your relationship with your faith.
All right, Imam Khalid Latif, thank you so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We really enjoyed today's session, so many inspiring moments and so much to take away from. To everyone who's tuned in, thank you for staying with us. It's been a near 2-hour session today, the longest we've had, and we'll be uploading this video onto our YouTube channel, and we'll send you the link when that's ready. Once again, thank you very much for your precious time, and inshallah, we'll meet again.
Thank you all.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.